Hello and welcome to the latest and last of our Vega videos dealing with GCSE History Unit 1, the Cold War, and we're today going to try and answer the big question above my head: how did the Cold War end? Now, the Cold War didn't end for only one or two simple reasons, and it certainly didn't end simply because of the actions of any one or two individuals. But we can't possibly understand the end of the Cold War unless we understand the career of two people in particular, namely Ronald Reagan, who was President of the United States from 1980 to 1988, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who was Premier of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. And there they are. So let's start with Ronald Reagan, since he comes into office first. So Reagan was elected in 1980. He was an enormously popular politician. He won 44 out of the 50 states in the 1980 general election. He was a Republican. He was very right-wing. He believed in small government at home. He had a long tradition of right-wing activism. He'd actually been involved in the House of Un-American Affairs Activities Commissions in the 1950s, and had at one point been a paid informant for the FBI. He was also a staunch anti-communist. When he came into power, he referred to the USSR as the evil empire, a term that he borrowed from Star Wars, the movie Star Wars. And whereas in contrast to other presidents who'd been in office during the period of détente, people like Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, even going back to Richard Nixon, presidents who'd been interested in peaceful coexistence, who'd been trying to develop better relationships with the Soviet Union, really accepting the status quo that existed between the two superpowers, Reagan had a very different approach. His approach was simple. He wanted to win. And he realized that the United States had one very significant advantage, and that advantage was the size of its economy. So the American economy was roughly twice the size of the Soviet economy at this point in history, and that meant that it could simply afford to finance military competition to a degree that the Soviet Union couldn't. Reagan took advantage of this to the fullest. So over the course of his two terms in office, he increased American defense spending by about $1 trillion, so just an unthinkable amount of money. He also very famously sponsored something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, there's that reference in the movie again, which was supposed to be a military shield that would enable rocket launchers mounted on space stations to shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles before they could land in the United States, fundamentally changing the balance of power between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, this never worked, but the mere threat of it, the mere investment in it, the rhetoric about it, all gave him tremendous leverage in his negotiations with the Soviet Union. Possibly more significant even than Reagan in ending the Cold War was Mikhail Gorbachev, who became leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Now, Gorbachev was an unusual type of Soviet leader. He'd been born after 1917, so he'd lived his entire life under communism, and he'd come to age and joined the Communist Party during the period of time when Khrushchev was in power. So he really believed in things like peaceful coexistence. He really believed in things like a reform into socialism. And he inherited an enormous number of social and economic problems when he became leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. The economy was backwards, as we've seen, throughout the 1940s, 50s and 60s. The economy performed at a really quite lamentable rate, far smaller, far less efficient than the West. People were poorer than they were in the capitalist West, so the economy not only was smaller and less efficient, but it also produced much less in the way of consumer goods, things that made people's lives better. It wasn't very good at producing things like jeans or better quality food or nice clothing. It was essentially an economy that was geared towards building heavy industry, so things like steel, iron, coal. As a result of this, crime, alcoholism, drug use, all of these were rising in the 1980s to levels that were really out of control. And people were also becoming very disaffected, disillusioned with their government because they recognised the degree of corruption that was taking place there. Remember, at this time, senior figures in the Communist Party were living very much similar lives to those of wealthy businessmen or wealthy politicians in the United States. So the gap between their standard of living and the average standard of living was quite extraordinary, and people knew this. They recognised that their governing people were not behaving in a way that was consistent with the values of communism. And that disaffection spread not just throughout the Soviet Union, but also throughout the satellite states. Now, Gorbachev was a communist. He did not want to end the system of communist government or the communist economy. What he wanted to do was to reform it. And his two main policy ideas were glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. And very simply, glasnost was an attempt to make a government more open, more transparent, to give people a better idea of what was going on and how decisions were made that affected their lives. Whereas perestroika was a more revolutionary idea. Perestroika was the introduction of very limited forms of market mechanisms into the Soviet economy, something quite similar to what Dubček had proposed in Prague in 1968, sort of socialism with a human face. And remember how well that worked out. That was very, very unpopular with members of the Communist Party because it's a complete reversal of the principles on which the communist economy had been run, really, for the past 60 years. Now, sticking with the theme of Reagan and Gorbachev, we need to understand the three major meetings that took place during the late 1980s between them. The first was at Geneva in 1985, and the second was in Reykjavik in 1986. Now, the most important thing to remember about both of these treaties is not that they reached any substantial agreement, either in terms of economic cooperation or nuclear non-proliferation, because neither of these things happened. What's important is that Gorbachev and Reagan themselves cemented a working relationship. So through better relations between the two leaders, relationships between the two superpowers gradually eased and began to improve. Now, Reagan felt that Gorbachev was a man that he could do business with, and at this point there was a phenomenon called Gorbimania, which was the extraordinary idea that Gorbachev at one point was a more popular figure in many Western countries, particularly European countries, than Reagan himself. So just enormously popular outside of the Soviet Union. So, as I said, the relationship was improving, even though specific attempts to develop agreements on issues like nuclear non-proliferation, the spread of human rights, none of those things really materialised in these two meetings, but the relationship moved on. And it moved on to such a point that just a year later, in 1987, we had the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is a very significant step forward in terms of superpower relations, because this is really the first time that we can talk about not just limiting the spread of nuclear weapons, but actually reducing the amount of nuclear weapons in the world. So the USA and USSR agreed in principle to remove their INF systems from Europe. They agreed to limit their missile warheads to 100 each, so parity of intermediate nuclear forces. And they were going to keep each other honest by inspecting one another's facilities, and there were very strict protocols for how often they could do that, what the teams needed to look like, and what type of access they had to be given. They also reduced the absolute number of missiles that they had. So reflective of their missile balances, the USA reduced its overall missile balance by over 800, and the USSR reduced it by over 1,800 under the terms of the INF Treaty. Now, there are other factors which are equally important in bringing about the end of the Cold War, and here is one of them. Communism, as I've mentioned, was increasingly unpopular, not just in the Soviet Union, but across the satellite states in Eastern Europe. So throughout this period, we see a wave, sort of a reverse domino theory of countries falling from communist rule into usually limited forms of democracy, increasingly to very overt forms of democracy. And this really began in Poland, where the Solidarity movement, initially a trade union movement, one that we would expect to be very, very sympathetic to the aims of communism, actually took a leading role in resisting the existing Soviet-controlled government in Poland, and under partially free elections in 1989, won an outright majority and formed a new government in Poland, which was much less closely aligned to the Soviet Union than the previous government. In Hungary, we had a prime minister who removed the border fence that had cut off access to Austria, which meant that almost 60,000 Hungarians fled to the west through Austria almost immediately in a matter of just a few weeks. We had several hundred East Germans who were camped out on the lawn of the West German embassy in Prague, trying to use that as a route to the west to escape. And they eventually made their way west on so-called freedom trains, which made their way through into West Germany. Now, it's important to remember that this is really a return to something resembling the refugee crisis of the late 1950s and early 1960s, which had very significantly jeopardized Soviet control of Eastern Europe. And finally, and in many ways most significantly, we have developments in Eastern Germany, where freedom demonstrations took place in Berlin and Leipzig, truly enormous demonstrations. So in East Berlin, we're talking about 500,000 people on the street protesting the need for open borders. In Leipzig, 100,000 people on the streets protesting for exactly the same thing. And eventually, this did lead to relaxation in visa controls at the border, because we have to remember, while all of these things are going on, while there is this groundswell of popular unrest in the satellite states, Gorbachev is also reversing the Brezhnev doctrine. So very simply what he says is that we will no longer continue to support powers within the Warsaw Pact with military force. So if they intend to do their own thing, if they intend to have limited democratic reforms, if they intend to change the way in which their economy is run, that's their business. We're not going to try and prop up failing communist regimes, because, simply put, the Soviet Union can no longer afford to do that. And what do we know about communist regimes in East Europe? When you remove the threat of repression, very, very quickly reform takes place and the governments themselves collapse. And that's very largely what happened after 1989, when the wall came down. That marks, in some senses, the symbolic end, if not quite the practical end, of the Cold War. So one further thing remains, and that's to explain the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. So Gorbachev's reforms had gone much further, much faster, and had a much more dramatic effect, both on the Soviet Union and on the world stage, than anyone, including himself, had really imagined. And in the Soviet Union, by 1990, 1991, the effects were very substantial. In 1991, the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, declared themselves independent from the Soviet Union. And this was an unprecedented move. We're not talking now about satellite states, we're talking about core states within the Soviet Union itself. Gorbachev recognized that he could no longer hold the Union together in the form that it had been for the previous 60 years. So what he proposed to do was surrender some of the central authority that had been held very tightly in Moscow to the regional capitals, or the state capitals of the member states. And this provoked an almost immediate negative reaction from a group of what we're going to call hardliners, or the Gang of Eight. And these were really old-style communists, Stalinists if you will, who opposed everything that Gorbachev had to do, or tried to do, and were particularly incensed at the idea that the Soviet Union could break up. So what they did was wait until Gorbachev was out of town, was outside of Moscow, to launch a coup d'etat in which they tried to use the army to take over the government and re-establish the Soviet Union on old-style Stalinist lines. Now the details of this coup are really are not something that we need to cover explicitly in this video, but suffice this to say that it was a disaster. It simply failed. So within 2 days the coup had collapsed, largely due to the enormous groundswell of support from people in the Soviet Union themselves. So they were very, very, very unhappy at the deposition of Gorbachev. They were extremely keen to continue with the reform movement. And in particular, the Moscow mayor Boris Yeltsin led a sort of popular revolt against the Gang of Eight, who were holed up in something confusingly called the White House, which you can see behind me, which is not the White House in Washington, but the White House in Moscow, where he essentially dared them to back down, and back down they did, and Gorbachev very quickly re-established control in the Soviet Union. But by this point he recognised that although he'd saved his own position, the Soviet Union itself was past saving. And in 1991, Gorbachev, under pressure of events, really dissolved the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was succeeded by its individual member states, places like Russia, Kazakhstan and others, who established their own independent governments. And very quickly, most of them converted to democracies and abandoned communism as a way of organising their economy. And by this point, with one of the superpowers having essentially exited the global stage, we can really talk about the Cold War having ended as a result, both partly of reform, partly of inertia, and certainly as a result of the slow turn in the tide of history.